All right, so this is your lecture on chapters 19 and 20. So have your outline in front of you as you go through this. 19 and 20 are about ecology, and the first part of chapter 19 talks about population ecology, so we'll move through some of that. What you see is on the slideshow, you see a population ecologist. What population ecologists do, they're scientists that will study populations and how populations are influenced by their environment and how they use their environment. And there's a lot of different data points that population ecologists need to take. So we'll look at some of the things and things that they look at. So this is a population ecologist checking on eggs on a certain type of penguin, this Gen 2 penguin. Here are some other population ecologists in California. I'm sorry, no, not in California, but on Smith Island, looking at this bird's nest. So one of the things about population ecologists is that sometimes you can't count the individual organisms. This first picture here, you can see the penguins and you can label their eggs, as you can see here. So these penguins are easy sort of to count and to keep track of. But if there are organisms that are hard to find, or if they're flying or in the ocean, then you can look for things like their nests. So you look for indicators that there are organisms present. You can look for burrows, for example, and you don't have to actually find the organism itself. So these people have found a very large nest. All right, so let's take a look at the factors that influence a population, and this is their density. So population density is how many individuals of a species you have per unit area or volume. So you have to decide the unit. Sometimes people use square miles or kilometers, and then you count how many, or you estimate how many individuals there are in that area. So you can either, again, individually, or you can look for indications of the organism. So you look at their density, and then you can also look at things like their structure. So what's the structure? What does their population look at or look like? So how many in each age group? What's their survivorship curve? We'll look at that. What adaptations they have. So you can look at their size and you can look at their growth rate. And we'll look at all these factors in this lecture. So the reason why population ecology is important is because that you can figure out what the best scenario is for a population, how the population uses its environment, and to really understand how the organism lives through its lifespan. And then you can use that information to do things like develop sustainable fisheries. The population of humans, of course, is ever growing on the planet, and we need to learn how to provide enough food for everybody and to have the food done in a sustainable way where you can continuously make the food without harming the resources on the planet. So if you understand the fish that you're growing, maybe you can understand better, what they need, what the appropriate population size is for them, how to control pests and pathogens, and then also to think about human population growth and how how we're going to affect the planet. All right, so let's take a look at some pictures here. So population density is not just knowing how many, but you need to know per unit area. So in this little scenario here, we have two square boxes. They both have 20 individuals, but the 20 individuals here occupy 100 square meters, or you can have 20 individuals within 25 square meters. So obviously, even though the numbers are the same, the density here, right, they're much more densely compacted here than they are here. So that's population density, is per unit area, right? How many individuals do you have? These are just some interesting, because you think about population density, you really think about really, really populated cities like New York. And so I wanted to show you this kind of interesting thing I found. So here's Los Angeles. The LA city limits are outlined in blue. So I don't know if you can see the blue line here, and the blue line goes up around here, So that's Los Angeles. That's the size of Los Angeles. And so they overlaid Los Angeles on top of New York. Okay, and then this is in red here, you can see the size of New York City. So if you look at the population, right, the Los Angeles has 3,884,000. New York has about 8,400,000. The area, right, we have Los Angeles occupies more area. So we have about 469 square miles we consider LA. New York City has 305 miles. And therefore, if you just do a little bit of division, then you can see that in Los Angeles, the population density is about 8,000 people per square mile, and New York is 27,000 people per square mile. So they are much more dense, right? Much, much more dense than we are. So they're going to be living in very tall apartment buildings, smaller units, right? Where in Los Angeles we have more space, fewer people, so we're not as dense. And for something like coronavirus, right, when there is a pathogen that is communicable, that's spread from person to person, the closer you are in proximity, the more dense your population is, the more rapidly it will spread. And that we saw that very clearly with coronavirus. In Los Angeles, we're not on top of each other like we are in New York. And so we have the ability to sort of maintain some distance between our neighbors, maintain some distance between other people. And so that's what gave us a little bit of a reprieve from getting a lot of coronavirus deaths. Let's look at San Francisco. Just another fun exercise. Now, take a look at the outline of Los Angeles. So this is blue, right? And on top of San Francisco. So here is San Francisco, tiny. Look at their population. So their population isn't that huge, right, compared to LA, but they have a tenth the area that we do. And if you look at their population density, look how dense it is. San Francisco has 17,800 people per square mile. That's more dense than New York. Oh, no, sorry, it's not 27. But much, much more dense than Los Angeles. Okay, so yeah, just some interesting tidbits if you want to think about the density of people. And so that's it for population density. So it's the number of individuals per unit area. And you can count, so here I have, you can count each individual, or you can use sampling techniques that extract the number of individuals by looking at nests or burrows. The second thing that you're seeing here is something called age structures. So population ecologists will create age structures to really understand what's going on in a population. And this is what an age structure is. So it's a graph. You have a lot of data, right? You're taking the males and females, you're counting them up in a population, you're looking at their ages, and so you're putting them in a graph. So in these pictures here, this is an example of Mexico's population in 85 and 2010 and in the predicted 2035. So one of the things about age structures that you can use these to predict what happens in the future. So let me just explain this. The line down the middle here is just one side is male, the other side is female. And if there's an unequal difference between them, that means that some populations might have more females, some populations might have more males. And then the bottom of this pyramid, this one's a pyramid, this one's not quite so much, but the bottom of your age structure will be the younger people in the population. And it's color coded here for so these area here, they're too young to start reproduction. So this is pre-reproductive age. In green, we're starting to reach the reproductive age. So this middle area in this age group, so you can see from like about 19 to, I don't know, mid 40s, it's reproductive age. And then you have post-reproductive age, so the older population up here. And it's color coded because if you have a very wide base, so you have a lot of young people, and in this case here in 1985, Mexico had the majority of their population was under the age of 19 or 18. And so when they age, right, in 10 years or 15 years, this wide base, these tons, the large amount of young people will move up into reproductive age. This means that they can keep that base wide because there's more people here to have more babies. And so the base stays wide, right? They're having babies here. And then if you just leap forward another 10 or 15 years, you'll find that those people have moved up. So we have a larger population of older people. This base moves into reproductive years. And since there's no change in birth rate, there's no drastic sort of change in either culture or, a disease or some kind of disaster, since the birth rate is the same, then we will maintain that wide base. And so using the age structure of a country can actually is a very good predictor for how the population will change in the future. So let's take a look at some other age structures. So this is the United States age structure from 2018. So we can see that we have a little bit fewer of our younger pre-reproductive year. Most of the population is in their reproductive years, and then we have a smaller amount of the elderly. Now, in your notes, I have, when you have an age structure that looks kind of like a pyramid like this is a sign that the population is going to rapidly increase because you have a large population of pre-reproductive children that are going to age into reproductive years. And so you're going to have this cohort moving up here reproducing and maintaining a wide base. So overall, the population is going to increase in a rapid way. If you look at something like this, so the United States is a little bit like this. This is still growing, but slower, okay, because we still have a pretty significant young population, but it's not as wide as the middle. And so it'll still increase, but not as much. So this is a slow growth graph, and then you have a decline. So when you have an inverted pyramid, something that has a narrow base, then you can predict that this population might be in decline because you have fewer young that will move into reproductive years. And then not all of these guys will reproduce, right? So the birth rate is actually kind of low. If that remains the same, it might even become more narrow. And so overall, the population will decrease. Right, so that's what I have in your notes. The pyramid with a wider base, we will see an increase in population, rapid growth. If it's an inverted or a narrow base, it's either growing slowly like this or it's declining. So in 2002, this is the world now, okay? 30% of the world's people were under 15. And then these guys are going to move into their reproductive years, right? 1.9 billion people. So this kind of, when you take the world's age structure and you see a third of the world is young, then you can predict that the world's population is rapidly increasing. In Nigeria, 44% of the population is under the age of 18. And it's TFR. This is just a term for how many kids each woman or each family has. Average is about 5.8. So they're not only replacing themselves, they're adding to the population. So as a result, Nigeria's current population of about 130 million is projected to reach about 305 million by 2050. So they're going to triple their population in the near future. So what Nigeria needs to do, right, is to understand that this is where they're heading, and then they need to make sure that they have the infrastructure in place, right? So now they have to think about food, resources, work, care for the elderly. So a lot of infrastructure issues that Nigeria needs to think about because they're dealing with a very rapidly growing country. All right, so that is age structure. And now another topic, letter C, is survivorship curves. So this is another characteristic that you can use to look at and study populations. So it turns out there's 3 basic curves that populations can take in terms of their survivorship. The survivorship is the rate of mortality over a lifespan. So what is the rate of dying? Mortality is basically dying over your life. So let's take a look at number one, survivorship curve number one. So we're familiar with this guy, right? This human. So if you look at the graph at time 0, so this is your lifespan, okay? So your x-axis is your lifespan. Here's your born. This is 50% of your lifespan. This is not age 50, but this is half of your lifespan. And this is you lived 100% of your lifespan. And then this one is this percentage of survivors, okay? So if you look at humans, we have very, very high survivorship when we're born. So as babies, we don't lose a lot of babies, human babies. There are, of course, deaths that happen to newborns, but in terms of overall averages, we're very, very good. So we maintain a very high survivorship curve. And then, so this tells you that most humans, almost 100% of humans, reach half of their lifespan. At this point, we start to have a little bit of a curve going down, right? So as we approach 100% of our lifespan, the mortality rate, right, the chances of dying or dying the mortality rate actually goes up, but the survivorship curve is opposite, right? So how many survive? Well, it starts to go down. So until nobody survives after 100% of their lifespan. So let's look at number 2. So survivorship curve number 2, such as a squirrel, follows their chance of dying, the rate of mortality is the same over their entire life. It doesn't matter what age they are, newborn, middle-aged, old, they have the same chance of dying their entire life. So that just means that their chances of death or their mortality rate is not influenced by their age. Okay. And survivorship number 3 is an oyster. And we can see that when they're born, right, little baby oysters, their newborns plummet, right? So they drop down, and then very few, right, very, very few are going to reach half of their lifespan, 50% of the lifespan. And then very, very few reach old age. So this is a massive die-off. What this means is there's absolutely no care for their young, right? These oysters basically create oyster babies, right? Their egg and sperm fuse. They're floating around little larvae. And then they just are plucked off by fish. So there's absolutely no protection or anything that's helping them survive. So there's a massive die-off, and just kind of by luck, we have some of our oysters growing to half of their lifespan and also to 100% of the lifespan. Whereas survivorship 1, right, the fact that almost 100% of our offspring survive till half the 50% of their lifespan means that we have really good child care. So infant care, child care is very, very good. And then the squirrel is just somewhere in the middle. Okay, so now curve number 1, does it have a high survival rate for the young? Yes, it does, right? Curve 2, does this curve have more of a mortality rate when young or old? No, it's constant. The straight line means that there's a constant mortality rate. Also, it means that there's a constant survivorship, right? Do many organisms from curve 3 make it to old age? Absolutely not, right? So we have very few organisms making it to old age. So this is just a little wrap up or a little synopsis, right? If you follow a type 1 survivorship, very low infant mortality, don't lose a lot of infants. There's a lot of input into the care of your offspring, right? And that's why there's very low infant mortality. Most mortality happens in old age. And some examples of organisms that follow this curve are going to be your larger mammals. And usually they have very few and large offspring. Okay, so they have 1 or 2 offspring, not a whole bunch. Survivorship 2, the mortality rate or chances of dying is the same during their entire life. So the chances of dying is independent of age. It doesn't matter how old you are, your chances of dying are the same. And examples of organisms here are lizards, birds, and rodents. Type 3 survivorship, we have a high mortality of the young because the parents do nothing. There's low energy input into the care of offspring. And most mortality as you're young, insects, these examples are insects, most of the invertebrates, turtles, many fish. They usually have a lot, you can't really see this, I'm sorry, it's cut off, but they usually have a lot, so many, and also very small offspring or little eggs, right? So they get plucked off. All right, so if members of a species produce a large number of offspring but provide minimal parental care, what kind of survivorship curve is expected? So that is going to follow the oyster curve, and that was curve 3. In contrast, if members of a species produce few offspring and provide them with long-standing care, then type 1 is expected, right? Okay. So you can look at the survivorship curves, and now we're into population growth. So you can graph the different kinds of growth that populations have by just their sheer numbers over time. And this one curve you're looking at here, this rapidly increasing curve, this is called an exponential curve. So exponential growth means that every time you have a new generation, it doubles. So all the organisms out there will have offspring, and so you're basically doubling the population every time you have basically another generation occurring. So when you do that, these dots will double, right? So every time you have a generation, they're going to double in size, and so this is the curve you're going to get. What is you need to know about this curve is that it is not, it does happen. There are these booms of population that follow an exponential curve, but then it stops because this is going to be an environment that is ideal and unlimited. So if your environment is ideal and unlimited, that means that you have all the niches that you need. So you have all the burrows or all the nests or whatever it is, like whatever living space that the organism needs, you have it. It's unlimited. There's plenty for everybody. And then you have all the food sources available to you, like everything an organism needs to grow and reproduce is present in adequate amounts. So that's not real, right? Exponential population growths exist, but they only exist for a very short amount of time because at some point there's going to be competition for those resources and organisms will stop to double, right? You're going to have these pressures, you're going to have food that's going to become scarce, you're going to have living quarters that become scarce, you might have mates that are going to be hard to find. So this is sort of theoretical. So exponential population growth can happen. You do see booms in population that follow this curve, but then it doesn't last for very long because you're going to hit reality where you're going to have competition. So let me just say that when you're starting off on an exponential growth curve, if you have a very few individuals of a certain organism like these rabbits, right, the environment might be plentiful to them. It might be ideal and unlimited because there's just so few of these rabbits in a certain area that, yeah, there's tons of living space and there's tons of grass. So in a short amount of time, they can rapidly boom, right? They can sort of increase in numbers very, very quickly. But then, of course, they hit that limiting factors. Okay, so let's take a look at limiting factors. Limiting factors are environmental factors that hold the population growth in check. It restricts the number of individuals that can occupy a habitat. So these are things like we're running out of food or running out of the perfect nest or whatever the living environment is. So these limiting factors, let me just show you a picture here. All right, so we have some fish. Notice the curve on this graph. This is an exponential curve. So for a while, these fish have all the resources they need and their population can double and double and double. But at some point, what's going to start to push their population down are these limiting factors. So we're having decrease in oxygen. There's low food supply. There's disease. There's predators. There's a limited amount of space. So all of these factors are going to keep the populations at a certain level of these fish. And that certain level, right, that's carrying capacity. So in this example, this pond, right, or this body of water has a carrying capacity for this species of fish. So it's not going to allow this fish to go, these fish can't go over in population because of these factors that keep it down. So let's take a look at this, right? The carrying capacity is the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain. All right, so it's the most amount of organisms, the maximum population that this particular environment can sustain. And then you're going to hit logistic population growth. So logistic population growth occurs when the growth rate decreases as the population size approaches carrying capacity. So let's look at this graph. So we have a population. So this is the actual numbers in purple. So we have a we have an exponential curve, and then it starts to go down, right? So you see this part of the curve. Actually, I'm looking at the dark purple one now. So this upward projection, that's exponential, but then as it curves the other way, this is logistic. All right, so this word, the logistic population growth. So you can see that you can overshoot carrying capacity, but if you do overshoot carrying capacity, the environment can't sustain this many individuals, so the population will crash a little bit. They can recover and crash again. When they overshoot carrying capacity, they crash again, and then they recover again, right? Overshoot it, crash again. So the average, right, this blue line is that carrying capacity, where it's basically that maximum level of organisms that a certain environment can sustain. All right, so let's take a look at this. So here is our exponential curve right here. So it goes up, 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 up. And then as soon as it starts to stop going up and it curves the other way, like right here, that's the logistic curve. So exponential and then logistic. And then we have carrying capacity right here, okay? So the question here is, what year did this seal population reach carrying capacity? And so you see this average, right? The dots are the actual data points, but then you can draw an average curve following those points. You can see the seal population overshot a little bit here. But what year did they reach carrying capacity? Probably right here, this dot, right? So it's somewhere in the 1938s. Okay, so that was our growth curves. So you want to be familiar with carrying capacity, what that means, and also the limiting factors. These are environmental factors that hold population growth down. So if we want to talk about limiting factors, this is our limiting factors, right? What is the environment short of, right? That's going to keep the population from growing exponentially forever. Okay, so let's talk about the next topic here, which is population density. So population density, how many organisms inhabit a certain area, there's two things that can influence it. There's density dependent factors, which is basically competition within that species, right? Within a species, which is what intra-specific means, it's within that species. They're going to compete for food, they're going to compete for territory, and there can be accumulation of toxic wastes that they create, right? So we're going to depress the population growth by increasing the death rate. When you have competition, there's going to be individuals that will lose, right, and they'll die. They'll either die from the actual competition, or they'll die because they're not getting the resources they need. And then you have density independent factors. So this doesn't matter how many organisms there are. It's completely independent of that. So weather or some kind of environmental disturbance. Let's look at some density dependent factors. This is a graph that looks at the growth rate of this bird, and this is the average number of eggs in a clutch. So this is 8 eggs, 9 eggs, 10 eggs, 11 eggs, 12. That's a clutch is how many eggs a bird lays at once. And then this is how many breeding pairs there are in the environment. So if you look at the increase in breeding pairs, right, as you get more and more breeding pairs, what happens to the average eggs in a clutch? Well, it goes down. So the fewer birds you have in an area, if you only had 10 or 20 breeding pairs, then you can assume that there's a lot of resources out there for these birds. There's not a whole lot of breeding pairs, and so they're going to be nice and healthy and fat, and they can have a lot of eggs in their clutch. As soon as you increase the density, right, you have 90 breeding pairs. That's a lot of birds looking all for the same resources. You're going to have competition, and that's going to hurt their average clutch size. So the birds are not going to be as fat or healthy, and you're going to have fewer eggs in that clutch. So how would you finish this sentence, right? Decreasing, there's a decreasing birth rate with, so hopefully you said an increase of breeding pairs. There's a decreasing birth rate, so this is our birth rate, we're going to decrease it. That's correlated with an increase in breeding pairs. Let's look at this one. So this is a percentage of survivors of this little beetle. This is the density of the beetle. So how is density and survival rate related with the flower beetle? The more dense the beetle population is, what happens to their survival rate? The survival rate goes down, right? So we can tell there's probably some kind of competition, right? Because the more crowded it gets, the beetles are going to start competing for resources, and it just can't sustain that many beetles, so their survivorship goes down. All right, now let's look at the boom and bust cycle. So the boom and bust cycles are happen in nature a lot because the organisms in an ecosystem are, intertwined with their prey and their predators. So let's just look at this boom and bust cycle. So boom and bust means it's a cycle that's characterized by periods of rapid exponential growth followed by steep population declines. So let's look at the prey, right? So the prey, and this we can think of it like the lynx and the hare. We have the example coming up next. So there's a prey that is going to, you see this curve should be familiar now. This is an exponential curve. Okay, so we're shooting up in population and we're reaching a peak of that population. So what does a predator do? So the reason why you have an exponential growth curve of prey is because the predator population is going down. The predators are dying off, allowing the prey to boom. But the more prey you have, the predators can recover, right? And they're going to have an exponential boom because there's so many prey. These predators, when they reach their height, look what's happening to the prey. They're going to start coming down, right? And when they go down, the predators are eating them all, right? So they're going to go down too. And when they're down, the prey can recover. So this is a classic boom-bust cycle where the predator and prey will follow each other's boom and bust. This is an example of the hare and the lynx, the cat here. So the hare is in blue, so we can see the hare is exponentially increasing here, and it coincides with that decrease in predator. When they reach their apex, right, then when they have a big numbers of hares, then our lynx population can bounce back, and that's going to decimate the hares again. So this is a classic boom-bust cycle that you can see over many years. It follows that boom and bust cycle. So predator and prey often follow a boom and bust cycle. All right, so we'll stop there.